That Joke Isn't Funny Anymore. Available on Amazon and everywhere. Hey guys, welcome back to the Lou Perez Podcast. I'm your host, Lou Perez. I'm very happy to be joined by my next guest. There wasn't a guest before this. This is what are we doing here? His name is James Masnov. He's the author of Rights Reign Supreme. And you could actually check out that book over at that URL, rightsreignsupreme.com. And he has a Substack called History Killers. James, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Where are you broadcasting from? Where
I'm in Oregon.
Oh, okay.
I'm about 15 minutes outside of Salem, a little over an hour outside of Portland.
Is there a different vibe between like Salem and Portland? Because we hear about Portland all the time. What's the if there was like there's a Portlandia, what's the Salamia, I guess, if there was a show?
It's just a lot more chill, a lot more diversity of views, a lot more acceptance of different views. I went to grad school in Portland. I'm pretty well familiar with it. I used to play there as a musician as well. And I'll be honest, I was never particularly a fan, but I liked their grad school at Portland State. And it just got progressively worse over the years. It's just, dumpster fire on top of a dumpster fire, really.
Yeah, I don't know where people get the energy to like nightly do like nightly burnings of like police stations and stuff. Like, I have two kids. I have a career.
Right.
And like the idea of just trying to find, I can hardly find the time to take a nap, let alone, expend the energy of, taking it to the streets. So I whatever Portland's got going on, maybe there's like something in the water or in the air that, just gives people that extra kick.
Well, it was funny. I was in grad school during the 2020 riots, and I had just finished my coursework, and so I was able to work on my master's thesis, which ended up being sort of the source material for my new book. And it was even before everything blew up with the events of because of George Floyd in summer 2020. It was already. I'm politically independent. I don't consider myself right or left. A billion years ago would have considered myself on the left. As many conservatives as I've grown to become friends with, I feel like they're waiting for the moment that I say I'm a conservative. It's just not going to happen. But I find common cause with people all along the political spectrum. And the thing that I noticed with Portland and with the university I was going to grad school, my grad school program, I would hear these like open borders arguments from people, and especially faculty, like all day long. But you need a card to access campus. Like you have a digital card that unlocks the doors to get into, because Portland State University is a very urban campus. It's right in the middle of downtown. And so I just thought it was very funny, all these open border arguments, but everybody's locking their doors, so because obviously there's a huge homelessness problem in Portland. And so if you have unlocked doors, a lot of people are going to come in who don't belong there. And that's just obvious. But, that sort of incoherence of the logic, a lot of the people I was surrounded by, some very smart people, it just kind of floored me.
Yeah, I find that like, for example, in Los Angeles, there's a section called Boyle Heights, and they are very much against gentrification, like to the point where you had people try to open like coffee shops and art galleries, real positive stuff. And they were picketed, and I don't know how many, how many stores had to close down and just get the hell out of there because the people didn't want them there. But then when it comes to issues of immigration, they're very much pro-immigration. Pro, I think, probably, just like free flowing, open borders, I guess, if you would call it that. Yeah. And it's just sort of that doesn't, that doesn't compute. It's like, do you believe in the free flow of human beings, migration of human beings, or are you about borders, whether they are, physical borders or, cultural borders, I guess in a way.
Right. And for me, it's just like, if you want to have the conversation, let's have the conversation. Like, for me, I think borders are necessary. We have doors, we have walls, for our house, kind of common sense stuff. But if people think we need to do more legal immigration, I remind people, we have more than 1 million legal immigrants into the U.S. every year. We have the most liberal immigration policy in the world. If people don't think that's liberal or generous enough, let's talk about it. Should it be 10% of the population? Should it be something more like 3.3 million every year? I'm willing to have that conversation. But can we separate the difference between legal and illegal immigration? And that's the argument they don't want to have. And, that's the conversation they don't want to have. They want to conflate different things. And so I feel like that's why the issue never really gets settled.
Yeah. I watched a really good video. There's a guy, I believe his first name is Andrew. He does Walk, Don't Run on YouTube. And he had a good video just about that, about, something that you never hear about are, how many people become citizens each year, and the breakdown from where they come from. So you have people becoming citizens who are from Mexico, from the Dominican Republic, from Bangladesh, and all these breakdowns. And, the idea that, the United States has a problem with brown people. It's like, well, there's a lot of brown people not only coming here illegally, as you described, but also becoming American citizens. I enjoy when conversations have, like, actual nuance, as opposed to just looking for the quickest way to get out of the conversation by, calling you a racist or any other, or any other thing.
I gotta say, if I can tell you, I loved We the Internet. I absolutely.
Oh, I'm wearing the hat.
Yeah. I just loved it, and every video I ever saw, I loved. But your, Don't Make Me Defend Trump video really spoke to me as a sort of disaffected liberal that was just could not believe the the insanity. I just couldn't believe the insanity of people who I knew who were blaming Trump. And there I was, a non-Trump supporter, finding myself in exactly that situation of like, what's going on here? And that just level of insanity, the way that you provided humor to that was really a gift.
Oh, thanks, man. No, I really appreciate that. That's one of those videos that I was pretty surprised by, just how it spoke for, I guess, like, so many people. There was I don't know if it's a silent minority, a silent majority, whatever you want to call it, but just the amount of people who reached out. They're like, yeah, I'm a liberal, or I'm a libertarian, or I'm a Democrat. And I've been in those situations where I hear someone saying something about Trump that's not true, or it's an exaggeration, and you want to come in and correct them. And of course, during those 4 years, if you said anything that could have possibly been could be viewed as something positive about Trump, even if it's just like, oh no, he actually said this, then you're automatically like a Trump supporter.
Right. Well, I think that video came to mind when you said nuance. Like, you couldn't have nuance, and that still happens to me. I still come across people, and I mean, I don't. Was it? I think it's been. Supposedly it was Churchill who said it. I don't know if that's correct, but that a fanatic is somebody who can't change their mind and can't change the subject, which is a line I really like a lot. And I think this qualifies for that, because I'm still coming across people who can't stop talking about Trump. They can't stop complaining. And it's just like, I don't understand.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, he's, it's still an ongoing, there's so many ongoing things. Like, for one, you wake up in the morning and you're like, the guy's being investigated, right? I don't know how many different investigations or actual lawsuits are taking place, and he's running for for president. So I don't know, as a historian, has there been another time where anything has been close to this? Like,
In a sense, yes. I'm glad you asked. So, and again, nuance, right? Nothing I'm about to say is a defense of Trump or anything he may have done. But the historical context is one of the things that he's been charged with is the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act came about during World War I under President Woodrow Wilson, the first Democratic progressive president. Not the first progressive president. I remind my conservative friends that the first progressive president was Teddy Roosevelt, but not long after him was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson and his colleagues got the Espionage Act passed in order to crush dissident against anti-war protesters who were against American involvement in World War I. But the Espionage Act was also used by Woodrow Wilson to go after his political enemies. He actually had the socialist Eugene Debs thrown into prison.
Yeah.
Similarly, by this supposed violation of the Espionage Act for being a political dissident. So here we are over 100 years later, and the Espionage Act is again being used to sort of railroad somebody, seemingly for political reasons. And again, I'm not saying that there aren't other legitimate legal reasons to go after Trump. I'm kind of neutral on that issue. But clearly, the Espionage Act is being used in a very similar way to how it was 100 years ago.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize, but like Debs did years in prison. Right?
Yeah, and was eventually pardoned, or at least he was commuted by President Harding. It took a Republican to get into office for him to get out, or at least to be pardoned.
Yeah, and with the Espionage Act, we could thank the Espionage Act and Woodrow Wilson for the great argument of you are not allowed to, you can't falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. The Oliver Wendell Holmes statement that a lot of people don't know what case it was for. So a lot of people are like, oh, it must have been a case where someone was falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater. And it wasn't that at all. It was Schenck v. United States, Schenck or Skank, which were, these, I believe, Germans who were passing out a pamphlet, I think in either German or Yiddish, basically saying, don't allow yourself to be drafted into this monstrous war. And that was them passing out, these anti-war activists passing out pamphlets were likened to a match that is about to set like a powder keg.
Yeah. So you teed me up perfectly, because that's in my book, Right Supreme. It goes through a sort of long arc history of the Supreme Court, but I definitely talk about the Schenck v. U.S. case with the Espionage Act and dissidents, during World War I. And yeah, you're absolutely right. What's amazing about that, and this is something that I'm an adjunct professor of history, and I do guest lectures as well. And anytime I have the opportunity to tell college students the sort of reality of what you just said, that this shouting fire in a crowded theater, how it's such a disingenuous framing. Right. It's never been a legal framework, right? It was just a sort of off the cuff, kind of ridiculous framing by Oliver Wendell Holmes. And yeah, exactly. What he was calling shouting fire in a crowded theater was actually protected speech that was anti-war. And another thing about those pamphlets that they were passing out, they had really strong constitutional arguments for, they weren't just against the war, they were against the draft. And for those who don't know, World War I was the first national draft. Technically, the first national draft was during the Civil War, but, half the country was at war with the other half, essentially. The first coast-to-coast national draft was during World War I, and part of the arguments by the anti-war movement at that time was against this draft. And in that same pamphlet that they were passing out that you mentioned, they also quote the 13th Amendment. They say clearly, the 13th Amendment makes it illegal to compel people into service. And so this is a violation of our own system, which I think is a very compelling argument.
Yeah, and we're recording this the day after Juneteenth, too. So to draw those parallels, right there. With your book, and what made you get into history and writing about history? Because I remember when I was in college. And I was like a literature, creative writing literature major. And I would look at, short stories that were written and like analysis of them. And it's like, what more could be said about Ernest Hemingway? There's like thousands of academic papers and stuff. And what is it with history that like you looked at it and you're like, no, there's more to this historical record that I want to, bring to light?
Yeah, well, so with my new book, I do think I offer a new take. It's an intellectual history of judicial review and the Supreme Court. Judicial review being the power of the court to nullify legislation it deems unconstitutional. Legislation or executive orders, this power of the court to say this law is unconstitutional and therefore is null and void. First of all, that is an awesome power. And it's a unique power. Not every modern democracy uses it. No modern republic or democracy uses it at the level that we do. And we were the first to ever use it. So it's a uniquely American concept, and it's built out of our separation of powers scheme. That the court keeps the other branches in check, among other things. But even though it's a legal history, a constitutional history, I call it an intellectual history because it's really much more about that. And intellectual history is the history of ideas. So it's really about what are the political philosophies, what are the sort of who are the thinkers that informed this role of the court to assert rights over the powers of government, among other things. And so I go back to John Locke, I go to Montesquieu, to these sort of intellectual giants of the 17th century, and then the founders as well. And, in some circles, it's really unpopular and unliked to assert the founders, but I have no problem doing that. I think that they were brilliant. And I mean, enormous flaws, of course, but and then there's also this controversy in historical and legal theory circles that some people argue the court was never supposed to have this power. You don't find this power in Article 3 of the Constitution. And I lay out the primary source evidence going all the way back to the Constitutional Convention, and actually even before that actually a lot of people were supporting and practicing this power even before there was a U.S. Constitution. So, but really, it's a matter of the recognition and the protection of rights, the relationship between the courts and the Bill of Rights, and how the courts are to be a steward of those rights, which I know how controversial that is for some people, especially with the Dobbs decision last year. And in fact, I held up the publication of my book when the Dobbs leak happened because I wanted to include it in the book to make sure it was relevant. And so we held up publication so I could do some additions regarding that once the official decision came out. But really, I think the take that I'm taking that was very new, because there's all sorts of histories of the Supreme Court, is looking at why do we have this power and what does it mean for the country, and how it's actually been strengthened over time, especially after the Civil War and with the ratification of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment supercharged the Bill of Rights and the court to recognize the Bill of Rights, not just against the federal government, but also against the state governments. And that's why the court has become more central to people's lives, basically from the beginning of the 20th century up to now. And I think people don't understand that. They don't understand how that history has worked, that things like the 14th Amendment has changed the role of the court because it's changed the role of the Bill of Rights and things like that. That was a lot to give you.
Yeah. Well, I doesn't really go. It seems like most things now just come down to like, what was it, the Commerce Clause, where
Oh, yeah.
fuck your state's rights.
Right.
There's a case, I forget what it's called. I don't know if it was. It's not London. I think London is the has to do with working or something like that. But wasn't there somebody who was arrested for growing wheat on his own farm at one point?
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of things that happened in the 1930s during the FDR. And yeah, exactly. I go a little bit into the Commerce Clause in the book and how ridiculous it got. I had to sort of restrain myself because you could easily write an entire book or two about just the abuse of the Commerce Clause beginning during the Great Depression. But yeah, I forget the name of the case as well. But yeah, so somebody was, and that was upheld, that somebody was impacting commerce, supposedly, even though he wasn't even selling his surplus to market. It was just for himself and his family. And yeah, those kinds of things are very ridiculous.
Yeah. So in your book, what's like the first time that, like, judicial review happens? Like when can you pinpoint that?
Yeah, so most people think that it's in 1803 with Marbury v. Madison. That's in like any sort of 101 class for U.S. history or political science or something. Marbury versus Madison is almost always the one that is asserted. Now, that case sort of made judicial review clear. John Marshall said it's the role of the court, or the duty of the court, to say what the law is.
And could you could you like kind of sum up what the case was? Because right now I'm like going back to like senior year of high school AP history.
Right. And in so many cases, the details of the case are less relevant than the decision, but it had to do with it's kind of ridiculous. Jefferson becomes elected, and Adams, on his way out, sort of packs the administrative offices of the executive government with a lot of loyal Federalists against Jefferson's Republicans, to make sure there's a sort of stronghold of Federalists that remain even as John Adams is leaving office. And somebody is supposed to get, I think he was Marbury. He was given some very low level position, but still, a federal level position. And Jefferson told James Madison, who was his Secretary of State, and it was his duty to do this at the time. It was the Secretary of State's role to actually literally hand out the commissions for these new jobs to the appropriate individuals who were given those jobs by the previous administration. And Jefferson told Madison, just don't give them the commissions. We'll just ignore that part of the process. They'll never receive their commissions and they never get the job. Right. So we'll sort of break the administrative chain. And that's that. And so Marbury said, I was already offered this position. You can't take it away from me for political reasons, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so it eventually goes to the Supreme Court. In the meantime, there has been this Judiciary Act passed that sort of protects Jefferson for having done that. And the Supreme Court says, you can't do that. We don't care what the law says you can do that. It's clearly a violation of your constitutional duty. And so that's judicial review, right? The court said, we don't care about this law that says you can do this thing. It's unconstitutional. So that's sort of the basics of what happened. And people point to that as the first instance of judicial review. Really, that just made it really, really clear. Mm-hmm. But my book actually spends a good amount of time on earlier decisions. At the federal level in the 1790s, there was this tax on carriages. These are the horse and buggy days. And there was a federal tax imposed on carriages, and somebody challenged it. And it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, this is fine. This is a legitimate tax. It's perfectly fine. Well, that's also judicial review. They just happen to agree with the law being constitutional. But it's less remembered because it wasn't judicial review that struck down a law, right? And there's all sorts of things like that through the 17 years and years before the Marbury case. I would say more importantly, you have instances of judicial review at the state level, actually during the Revolution. Massachusetts gets rid of slavery. It's the only state to do this. It gets rid of slavery through judicial review.
Wow.
Yeah, in the early 1780s, when the Revolution is still happening. Now, most of the major battles are over by the early 1780s, but there's no Treaty of Paris until 1783. Well, in that same year, the official end of the Revolution happens, and the United States is recognized by the world as an independent nation. Massachusetts, through a series of court cases where enslaved persons challenged the constitutionality of their enslavement, they point to the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, written by John Adams, which has a Declaration of Rights. And they say this Declaration of Rights clearly makes slavery unconstitutional in the state of Massachusetts. And the highest court ends up agreeing with them. And that's how Massachusetts gets rid of slavery. For those who don't know, slavery existed in every state up to and through the Revolution. And then the northern states start phasing it out, sort of in this long, slow, decades-long, generationally long process in most cases. Massachusetts is one of the few to get rid of it in a sort of immediate way. And they're the only state to do it through judicial review.
Wow, I had no idea. I'm just wondering, like, what do those early decades look like when, here's the one state that, slavery is illegal? Would it be? Or is, can you bring if you're from out of town, can you bring your slave to Massachusetts and then bring them back? Or
Right. Well, and that's a story that goes on for a long period of time. I'm here in Oregon. Most people on the West Coast, in the Western states, but especially the West Coast, feel as though, the history of the West Coast is sort of removed from the legacy of slavery. But there's this book called Breaking Chains by Gregory Noakes. I was able to interview him a couple years ago. And it's all about how some people, particularly from Missouri, in the mid 1800s, when slavery was still going on, actually brought their slaves with them on the Oregon Trail. And there were slaves brought to Oregon in the 1840s, 1850s. And there's one slave case that actually happens in Oregon Territory sometime in the 1850s, I believe. But yeah, so it's a crazy history for sure.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, we're recording the day after Juneteenth. Something wild that I found was, after slavery was eradicated in the United States, Native Americans still practice slavery for quite a few years. That it actually took the United States to help liberate slaves from some Native slave masters.
That's right. Yeah. So the Chickasaw is one example where for at least another year they held on to their slaves, because for all of the sort of broken treaties and all of that stuff, Native American nations were viewed as sovereign nations, legally speaking. And so the 13th Amendment had no impact on Native Americans who owned slaves. And so only through the process of creating new treaties with them and basically forcing them to get rid of their slaves as a condition of these new treaties, did some of these Native American nations get rid of their slaves.
Yeah. Like I said, I discovered that. I discovered it. I'm the one who found it out. I heard about that, a couple of years ago. And it's one of those things that, you hear about and you're like, what, how can this be? I've never heard this before. I think where I first came across it was, there was, Louis Gates had a show on PBS talking about the ancestry of celebrities. And one of his guests was the actor Don Cheadle, great actor. Yeah. And Don Cheadle is a descendant of slaves, but what he discovered is that he wasn't the descendant of white slave masters. He was a descendant of, I believe it was the Chickasaw slave masters. And that, completely almost made his head explode on camera, because, what we learn and, what is, the norm is, white slaveholders in the United States. So when you're writing, your books, when you're doing research, like, what are like some of the things that you discovered that you're like, holy shit, like I had no idea, because that must be a big part of it, right? It's like sort of the investigating, doing detective work and just finding stuff that maybe it's going to change the direction of your book, possibly. And what were some examples of that?
Well, the one from my book that got me was there's this Congressman John Bingham, and he's responsible for the first section of the 14th Amendment, the one that ends up enforcing the Bill of Rights against the states during Reconstruction. And it turns out in my research, he also opposed Oregon statehood years before the 14th Amendment. I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. What's that about? And it's because when Oregon was trying to become a state, its original constitution, some people know this, a lot of people don't. The original Oregon Constitution did not allow African Americans to reside in the state.
Wow.
So Oregon was a simultaneously anti-slavery, but also anti-black constitution. And that was why John Bingham opposed it, was because he was years ahead, where he thought the Bill of Rights should apply to the state governments as well as the federal government, which he argued we can get rid of slavery in this sort of way, right? We can have the same expectations and limitations on the states that we have on the federal government. And so he saw in sort of a Bill of Rights sort of vision of looking at Oregon statehood. It's like, well, they're not recognizing the equal rights of even free African Americans, forget those who are enslaved. And so that's why he opposed Oregon statehood. And that clause in the Oregon Constitution remained for many years. And in the early years of Oregon, there are these lash laws where they actually would exact corporal punishment on African Americans if they didn't leave the state. It's crazy stuff, especially when you think about how supposedly progressive Oregon is now. Nowadays, it's a part of history a lot of people don't know about or want to think about.
I mean, I'm just thinking about the Portland Trailblazers. Like, man, what the fuck? What the fuck would Oregon do if all you could have was just white players?
Yeah,
exactly.
Like
what Vlade Divac? I think was that one of the just 12 of those guys.
Right.
That's so interesting. Okay. Sorry.
Something else. It's not in my book, but it's something I bring up to my students a lot because I think it's one of those things that you're talking about. The sort of I'm fascinated by the complexities of history. That's what makes it interesting. I think you and I are similar in that way. Is that's the nuance, right? Like we're interested in the nuance. Like things are always more complicated than they're often framed. But you take somebody like Thomas Jefferson. We know about Sally Hemings, right? His one of his slaves, a young woman, and different historians agree or disagree about them having a relationship. We do know that DNA bears out that her children had Jefferson DNA. Well, we don't know if it's him. So that's the thing. Like it was a male Jefferson. It might not have been him. So it's circumstantial evidence that leads to him. But let's just say it was him, okay? Just for the moment, for the sake of argument. Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Jefferson's dead wife.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
So Sally Hemings was the offspring of Jefferson's father-in-law. He impregnated one of his slaves, Sally's mother. And so Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Martha Jefferson, who died in the 1780s before Jefferson ever became president or anything. So this complicates the issue, right? It's not just Jefferson. And again, we don't even know if it bears out that it was he who impregnated Sally Hemings. And she had a number of Jeffersonian children, if we can call it that. But let's just say it was him. That is some nuance right there. Did she share certain features physically or personality wise of his deceased wife? Were they at all similar? We do know that Sally Hemings was 3/4 white, which is not often how she's represented in, dramatizations and things like that. So anyway, that's just another sort of complexity that, if it is true that it was Jefferson who had this ongoing sexual relationship with Sally Hemings for many years, it makes it much more complex if she was the half sister of his deceased wife.
Yeah, for sure. And also like the, the relationship too, like, she's owned, right? But
Right.
It's like, what is like her day-to-day tasks? Like, is she doing like menial work? Is she, working in the house? Like it's, I think, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is sort of the problem of looking back into history through the lens of, contemporary times and, how we do things, because it's very tough to even imagine slavery, let alone all the complexities that come with, having children. Like I'm a dad.
Yeah.
I have my two sons, and the idea of like, if I had a slave and impregnated her and she gave birth, and those are my sons, but yet I would treat them, like they were lower than my boys. It's it's like what is even that, like those relationships, those incredibly complex things.
It is really complex, and you made me think of this. Is also not to overly plug my book, but this is also in it. There's the figure of Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley is one of the first known American poets. She was an enslaved woman, and she was originally owned by a Massachusetts, New England family in the 1700s. And she ends up becoming so well known. She actually travels England because she becomes this recognized poet. And so she's eventually freed, because that's kind of embarrassing, right? But her name is Phyllis because she was named by this Massachusetts family that bought her as a child. She was named after the slave ship she came in on, called the Phyllis. And it was the Wheatley family that bought her. And we don't think of Massachusetts and like New England in this way. But what's very interesting is that they decided to, just like they did with all of their children, to educate her, which was why she was able to read and write. And so even though she was an enslaved child, they ended up educating her and treating her as sort of some type of family member, to the point where she becomes this very celebrated poet. But that's really complex when you think about like New England Christians and slavery and this, poet who's named after the slave ship that she came in on. It's complex stuff.
Yeah. I'm like, wonder what the hell the equivalent would be. Like, there are people in my town, there's lakes and they have boats. So you have like goofy names, like on the boat. So right. I'm just imagining like, you name your slave after like, I'm trying to even think like, I'm trying to think like, what are some goofy boat names? Like, beer goggles or something like that.
Right.
It's like, this is incredibly gifted poet named Beer Goggles Wheatley. It's oh man, no, that's wild. When you're writing your book, how did you know you were done with it? Because I know you said you held it. You held your latest one for the Dobbs decision,
right?
And which we never found out who the leaker was, right?
Right.
It's unreal that we don't know who the leaker
Agreed.
is. That's. I'm no conspiracy theorist, but I have a feeling somebody knows who the leaker was.
Somebody has to know, right?
Yeah.
But
barring that, like, how do you know when your book is done?
Well, I mean, you've written a book, like, it's large, I'm sure it's the same. What's the expression? Works of art are never finished. They're just abandoned. Even works of history are to some degree that. It's just like, I guess I'm done. right? Like, because I guess with writing history, it's a little bit like, well, I think I'm done with the research. Like there's enough here, and so I can kind of just leave it be. There's also a lot of revisions in the process. This was a master's thesis, and then I adapted it into a manuscript, and then I did even further revisions at that point. Once I got a book deal, I got no notes from McFarland Publishing. They liked it as is, which was pretty amazing, even after their peer reviewers and all that. But I kept kind of tinkering with it until I submitted the final manuscript. And I thought I was done until that Dobbs leak happened. But whether it was this or my first book was a collection of essays, some of which originally appeared at places like New Discourses, James Lindsay's site and stuff like that. But I'm curious if it was similar for you. Like, at some point, it's just like you feel like you're done, right? It's hard to put words to it.
Yeah, so before I took on the book, I was just thinking like, there's no way I have enough for a book. Like, there's no way that I'm able, like how many like what, like 50,000 words plus? Like, there's absolutely no way. And then as I started like looking at stuff I had written before and like published in other, online magazines and stuff, and started putting things together and saying, oh, I want to write about this subject and this subject, and oh, this story works for this or this. After a while, I was like, okay, now I have too much. Like, and there were some chapters that I wanted to write, but I was like, dude, I'm so fucking burnt out. Like, there's no way I want to do this. And for me, so like in my book, there's kind of like, there's, somewhat of an arc, of kind of what I'm going through as I'm writing this and looking back on comedy and all that. And the end kind of made itself known after I had gone through it, and it was like, oh wow, this whole time I'm sort of like building up to this thing that I didn't know was in me until it was out, on the computer screen, really. And then I had a really good experience with my publisher and the proofreaders and all that. And the one tricky thing was writing the first chapter, because as my publisher said, he's like, you know who you are, we know who you are, but somebody reading this, they don't know who you are. So right. You need to be able to present, the subject matter right off the bat and explain to them why you're writing this and why it's important. And then also, draw them in. So it was like, out of all the pieces, it was the first chapter was the one that took the most like rewrites and, sort of trickery. Like I was in the first chapter, there are a number of bits that were originally separate chapters, like later on in the book, that I had to bring. So if anybody out there is writing a book, what I recommend is get some index cards and write the names of the chapters on those index cards, and get an empty floor and sort of plot them on the ground, and then start looking at them kind of as like a conspiracy theorist to see where the links are, and start moving stuff around, and then it'll start to make sense.
It's so funny is that I'm in the process of writing like this kind of 6-article series for my Substack, and it's all about how to go through the process of writing a book. And I'm going through all my past notes, and it's exactly what you said. For me, it's full pages, but it's the same idea of having just piles of paper and exactly having empty space, just lay it all out. And I think the subtext there, and I emphasize this when I write about it, write by hand. Like, maybe not when you get to the actual process of writing your book, but when you're doing notes, when you're organizing your ideas, I think writing by hand actually helps a lot. I think it helps you to organize your ideas. I'm curious, in your case, I used to, doing music was a huge part of my life. And then as I pursued a history career, it's much more on the side now. I don't tend to think of those things as having a whole lot of overlap, except for when things like what you just brought up, the sort of discovering when you're done. I'm curious if comedy is the same way. So when you've been writing stuff for stand-up or any sort of comedy project you're doing, is it a similar thing? Because I have found that with songwriting, it's similar to an article or a book in that you don't necessarily know where it's going, but it finds itself and it presents itself eventually. I imagine comedy might be similar. Is that true?
I think so. And, you know, what you brought up about like writing by hand, it's something where when I take notes, I definitely do that. I think it's Chuck Palahniuk. That's how he writes his books. Like he writes them out and then he'll have somebody like, you know, type them. For me, I get sort of like OCD. So I would just, if that was the case for me, I mean, I don't think there would be enough paper in the world really for me to keep going back and erasing stuff and all that. I think with comedy, you know, it's sort of depending on which medium you're presenting the stuff. So like sketch comedy versus stand up, right? So with sketch comedy, what are you working with? You're trying to get something in like 3 to 5 minutes at the absolute most. So there's sort of like length that you're dealing with. So like those time constraints. And then with stand up, it's sort of like, how can you get, well, I think with everything in general, it's like, how long can this be while still making it interesting? You know, if it's sort of, because there is sort of like, there's one-liners that will just work as a one line, you know?
Right.
But then you might be able to string together 5 one-liners, and now that works as its own self-contained bit, right? And then maybe you try to add a few more one-liners, but those aren't funny. So now you're like, okay, well, those got to go. And I think sometimes too, it's sort of you're done working on a bit where it's like, okay, these are the lines that I'm saying that work. And right. I don't want to push it. I don't want to push it any further because like these work and they stand like on their own.
Well, that's another similarity then from what you were saying in your process of writing your book. And I found the same thing, being a good editor, right? Being a good self-editor, knowing like, oh, I would love to write about this and go off on another tangent, but maybe it swerves off course too much. It's like that just needs to be a separate idea or a separate project. I think being a good self-editor has a lot to do with everything we're talking about.
Yeah. And there's something about, so I went to grad school for creative writing. And I remember one guy had turned in a story during like a workshop, and I think he opened the story with like, you would call her a girl with a reputation, period. And then he kept going about like, she, slept with all these guys and, she had these big fake breasts, just all this stuff. And our, professor basically like took that and just cut out everything that came after, you would say she had a reputation, because it's sort of like, you just said it all there. Yeah. Very strongly, right to the point. And then you allow the reader to sort of envision what, this woman is that you're describing.
Absolutely.
And it was a much stronger piece. So, so you're a musician. What instrument do you play?
Guitar, bass, drums, vocals.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Vocals. I always, anytime I meet like people who can sing, I'm always just so jealous, man.
Well, I don't know if I can, but when it's rock and roll, it doesn't matter.
I guess so. And so what kind of rock and roll?
Well, the band is called Masonic Block, masonicblock.com if anybody's interested. But I mean, it runs the gamut, everything from like acoustic folk to punk rock to metal, experimental noise, ambient soundscapes, really goes all over the place. We'll be releasing our 11th studio album.
11th. Wow.
This summer. Yeah. and I have less and less time to do that stuff. So, now that it's summer, I may or may not be teaching a summer class. I'll find out this week. Whether I do or not will sort of help to schedule what my summer looks like for working on music. But I used to tour nationally and all that kind of stuff before I pursued this history career.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love everything from the Beatles to the Ramones, Simon and Garfunkel to the Swans and Dead Kennedys, so my sort of diverse fandom is channeled into the kind of music I do.
Yeah. And talking about, I guess how, music would, differ from, the regular, writing of books and comedy and all that. I mean, you're dealing with other personalities, right? I mean, all the guys in your band, I would imagine,
Yeah.
So it's sort of like you might love something. I don't know how it is. Maybe, maybe you run a dictatorship. I don't know. But I imagine that a little bit.
A little bit. Yeah. Well, I mean, just, I tend to be the primary songwriter, so that helps. And I don't, this is just my personal opinion. I don't think that most bands work well as democracies. It's just, it helps. I'm not making a one-to-one comparison here. I want to be clear, but it helps if there's a Lennon McCartney component. It helps if there's a Mick and Keith and Mick, one or two people who sort of set the tone,
right,
and have the vision, and then you have really talented players who can help kind of fulfill that vision.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I'm thinking about I love there's a guy named Rick Beato who's
I love Rick Beato. Yeah.
I think it's impossible not to love Rick Beato,
Absolutely.
And I think he connects people like yourself who are, professional musicians to guys like me who, just like to listen.
Yeah.
And he has like so many guests on like interviews. Like he interviewed Sting. He interviewed, there's a guitarist from the band Toto who he was like Michael Jackson's guitarist on Thriller. And, what I find is, even like the hardest like metal guys absolutely love like Stevie Wonder, who, it's sort of like the guys who actually are making this stuff, what they're into is just it's so much broader examples of music than like perhaps the fans, or at least I'm thinking of like, when I was a 12-year-old kid and like I was into like the band Helmet, and it's it's like I was into the band Helmet, and if you like this band, and you can't like that other kind of music,
Right.
But meanwhile, like Paige Hamilton, he's the lead singer guitarist. He's like a jazz guitar player too, like classically trained in that. So yeah, I find that cool, and also just like as you get older too, and you start listening to music that's been around for forever, but you didn't know it exists. So the first time you're hearing it, well, it's like the first time you're hearing it, and you're like, what is this? What is this world that I'm, being exposed to right now? Finally.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the creative process, which turns out is a lot of what we've been talking about anyway, has a lot to do with, I mean, of course, just as a listener, as a fan, I love Stevie Wonder, but he was also the first musician to do a full album where he played all the instruments. Stevie Wonder was the first to do that. Just the level of talent and creativity, I think that's also what a lot of artists and musicians are drawn to. And then if you're not a fan of the music first, but you're like, wow, he did that, and then you go and discover that level of talent, that also draws you in.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think like with is there a Stevie Wonder now? Like, is there, somebody now? I often think of like the Traveling Wilburys, right? Who was it Bob Dylan?
I love those guys. Yeah. Bob Dylan, Jeff Lynne, George Harrison, Tom Petty, and Roy Orbison.
And it's like, how that band, like the idea that, all those greats got together to do a band, like, is there an equivalent of that today that could happen? Like, I don't know.
And even in their own time, they were actually a super group that were good.
Right.
Like I love Traveling Wilburys, but you come across some of these super groups and your expectations are raised, and then you listen to it, it's just like,
yeah,
right. They end up being less than the sum of their parts oftentimes, which is surprising. But I don't know that. First off, music is in such a different place right now. That had nothing to do with the direction I took to sort of go on a different path with history, but I've, witnessed it, and we're in a time right now where there are still people who love music, but sort of culturally, it's treated like wallpaper. It's just that thing that you have playing in the background on your phone. It's not central to people's lives like it's been at other eras. I was a youngster in the 90s, and music was everything to me, and that I wasn't alone in that. I think we might come to another period where that's the case. I don't think we're there right now. I feel like the last time we had a Stevie Wonder type, it was probably Prince, who is equally capable of like doing all the instrumentation himself on his albums, though also a really good collaborator. I think we'll see those kinds of geniuses again. And I'm not trying to disparage anybody who's sort of in the milieu right now, but nobody comes to mind for me currently.
I have a friend of mine some years back, because Prince, I mean, he's been gone for what, like 5 years, maybe more. Was it 2015 or 2016? It's been a long time. Yeah, crazy how quickly that's gone. But so when Prince was around, he was doing these really small club dates in Los Angeles. I think it was like 3 or 4 nights, and each night he was doing like a different, sort of incarnation of Prince. So there was like the rock Prince, the R&B Prince, and my buddy was so excited that he's like, I'm getting tickets. We're getting tickets to this night. And so he and a couple of his friends got tickets, and they go to Prince. They're like, oh man, we're going to hear, Little Red Corvette, Raspberry Beret. We're going to hear, all this stuff. And they apparently bought tickets for Prince's jazz night. And they were like, ah, fuck. Like we love Prince, but this isn't Let's Go Crazy. This isn't, Purple Rain.
Were they musicians? Because I feel like a musician would love that.
He plays guitar, but I don't think on that point, on that level where he would be inside. Because I mean, jazz also is just its own thing. It's like
definitely,
to be able to get that to, total respect to the players of jazz, but sometimes they're operating on a very different wavelength than a normie. Like me. I'm so glad you mentioned Raspberry Beret. I feel like that gets lost in the mix, and that's my favorite Prince song. Is it your favorite Prince song?
I love that song. Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same 3 chords over and over and over again. If you actually learn to play it, it's just 3 chords, and it doesn't even change to go from verse to chorus. It's just the same 3 chords over and over and over again. It's brilliant.
Yeah. I've become a big fan of like lyrics that come out of nowhere. Like to describe something as a Raspberry Beret, like I don't know where that comes from, but I like hearing it because it's so different,
Yeah, I think that's your literary side.
I think so. Yeah, I've gotten into like I'm listening to like Paul Simon lyrics are really interesting.
Oh yes.
And just people putting together sentences that I would never, that normally wouldn't exist, and just like, oh, and he's singing in a beautiful voice too. Like there's a lot going on here.
No, I know it's a cliche, but I do believe that Bob Dylan is the greatest American songwriter. Not the greatest songwriter. I'm probably partial to John Lennon on that front, but the greatest American songwriter. But I have always said that if it's not Bob Dylan, then the greatest American songwriter is Paul Simon.
Nice.
In my view.
Yeah. Do you ever think about, doing like a history of music, like some version of that, like bringing the two together?
A little bit, and I've done a few articles here and there on my Substack. My Substack is mostly a mix of social commentary. That's where the history killers comes from. I go after people who seem to be not good at history or are disingenuous in their presentation. I'm a big critic of the 1619 Project, for example. But I also have sort of like other stuff where Well, in fact, it just went up. There's a musical component in the current article that's at History Killers right now. A few weeks ago, I had an article when cowboys were rock stars, and it just tracks this sort of cultural history of the cowboy, basically from the 1880s, where they actually existed, up to the sort of cultural peak in the 1960s. And so my newest article is, so that was when cowboys were rock stars, and so the new one is when rock stars were cowboys. And it's all about how from the 60s through the 80s, rock stars took on the cowboy aesthetic.
Oh, yeah.
So like the Eagles' Desperado, all the way through the Bon Jovi stuff in the
Young
80s.
Guns. Yeah, Young Guns movie with the Jovi soundtrack. Yeah.
Yeah. So I like kind of mixing history with that sort of pop cultural component. That can be a lot of fun.
Oh, that's dope. You know, I'm looking forward to reading those for sure. I saw this meme a little while back where they said at some point in time, it would have been possible for Abraham Lincoln to send a telegram to a samurai in Japan. It's sort of like these three things happening at the exact same time.
Right.
Something like that.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that kind of stuff. I just finished teaching 19th century U.S. history to a college class here locally, and that kind of blows my students' minds when we get past the Civil War and Reconstruction, and then we're in the Old West in the 1880s, and then you get to the 1890s, and it starts to look like today. It's like there's passenger trains, there's subways, there's telephones, there's electricity. It's like suddenly there's skyscrapers and the building of cities. And, it's like 2 seconds after the Civil War, it's in America that's very recognizable to us today. I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that I want to say too is the, talking about like the Cowboys, when Cowboys were rock stars, like, take, someone like James Joyce. When growing up, James Joyce as a little boy, like he read cowboy stories, like that was the popular, culture, and that's what people would think of America,
Absolutely.
home of the Cowboys and all that. Well, James Masnov, thank you so much for joining me today. For those of you interested in checking out James's stuff, head over to his Substack, History Killers, and he's got 2 books going. One of them is Rights Reign Supreme, which could be found, I believe, at the same URL. And the other one, what was the one before that?
The first book is also called History Killers.
Oh, cool, sweet.
Yeah.
That'll make it so much easier when they're Googling you. So,
yeah, absolutely.